Gemini set. The porcelain tea set shattered against the marble floor, spraying steaming Earl Grey across Hana's bruised shins. CO Julian Vane didn't look up from his tablet as he ground his Italian leather loafer into the delicate shards, making them crunch like bone. Clean it up with your tongue, Hana. It's more than a gutter rat like you deserves. He reached out, his fingers twisting into her ponytail, yanking her head back until she was staring at the gold leaf ceiling. The scent of his expensive cologne mixed with the metallic tang of the blood blooming in her mouth. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She simply looked at the digital clock on the wall. It was 6 p.m. The glass front doors of the Vane estate didn't just open, they disintegrated. A wall of black-clad men moved in a silent, lethal tide, and at the center stood a man whose face was a map of scars and cold fury. Julian's hand froze on Hana's hair as the air in the room turned to ice. 10 minutes ago, Hana was a ghost in a lace apron, a woman Julian bought from a debt collection agency to serve as a punching bag for his ego. He thought he had found a victim with no name and no past. He didn't see the way her hands moved with the precision of a surgeon or the way she counted the seconds until the sun dipped below the horizon. This is the moment the hunter realized he was sitting in a trap designed by the very prey he had been torturing. Julian Vane built an empire on stepping on the weak, but tonight he was about to learn that some shadows have teeth. Hana's knees stayed pressed against the jagged porcelain. Julian's grip tightened, his knuckles white. "Who the hell invited you in?" he barked, his voice cracking. The man in the center of the room didn't answer with words. He adjusted his cufflinks, the silver reflecting the red emergency lights now pulsing through the mansion. This was Kangdae. To the world he was a myth, the dragon of the Korean underworld. To Hana he was the man who had spent 3 years burning down every obstacle between them. He stepped over the shattered remains of a $5,000 vase as if it were trash. "Take your hand off my wife," Kangdae said. The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush lungs. Julian's hand fell limp. Hana stood up, the lace apron falling to the floor like a discarded skin. She didn't look back at the man who had spent months shaming her. She walked toward the man who had come to claim her. Every step left a faint smear of Earl Grey on the marble. Kangdae met her halfway, his hand reaching out to trace the red mark on her cheek where Julian had struck her earlier that morning. His jaw set, a muscle leaping in his cheek. He didn't ask if she was okay. He knew. He turned his gaze back to Julian, who was now backed against his mahogany desk, his fingers fumbling for the panic button. "The security lines were cut before we crossed the gate, Mr. Vane. Your guards are currently being re-educated in the garden." Kangdae's men moved with rhythmic efficiency, flanking the room and blocking every exit. Julian's breathing was a ragged, wet sound in the hollow space. He tried to straighten his tie, but his fingers shook too hard to catch the silk. I didn't know. She was just a maid. The agency said she was a nobody." Kangdae stepped closer, his shadow stretching across Julian's face. "There are no nobodies in my family. Only people waiting for the right time to strike." He pulled a heavy, black-lacquered folder from his inner pocket and tossed it onto the desk. It slid across the wood, knocking over a crystal decanter of scotch. The folder fell open to show Julian's private bank statements, his illegal offshore accounts, and photos of the night he thought he had covered up 3 years ago. Julian's face went the color of curdled milk. Hana watched him, her arms crossed, the coldness in her eyes a perfect mirror of the man standing beside her. She had spent months collecting these files, enduring the insults, the spilled tea and the back-breaking labor just to get close enough to the primary server in Julian's office. The maid was the only person Julian never bothered to hide his screen from. If you believe that the person cleaning your floors might be the one writing your downfall, hit the like button so Hana's revenge reaches everyone who thinks they can bully the quiet ones. Julian reached for the folder, but a heavy boot slammed down on his hand, pinning it to the mahogany. One of Kangdae's men leaned in, his face inches from Julian's. "Don't touch the evidence, Mr. Vane. It's for the authorities." Julian looked at Hana, his eyes darting like a trapped animal's. "Hana, please. I can give you anything. Double your salary. Triple it. Just tell him to stop." Hana walked to the desk, picked up the crystal decanter and slowly poured the amber liquid over the folder, soaking the papers. "I don't need your money, Julian. I already took it. Check your balance." Julian's eyes went to his tablet. His trembling fingers swiped across the screen. The numbers weren't falling, they were gone. A string of zeros stared back at him. The Vane Empire hadn't just crashed, it had been hollowed out from the inside. Kangdae leaned over the desk, his voice a whisper that carried the weight of a funeral bell. "You shamed her for being poor. Now you can experience it for yourself. He signaled to his men. Two of them stepped forward, grabbing Julian by the arms of his expensive suit and dragging him toward the door. Where are you taking me? Julian screamed, his heels skidding across the marble he had once been so proud of. To a place where Earl Grey isn't on the menu, Kangde replied. He didn't look back as the CEO was dragged out into the night. He turned to Hana, his expression finally softening into something human. He reached out, his thumb brushing away a stray tear she hadn't realized she'd dropped. Is it over? He asked. Hana looked at the shattered tea set, the empty desk, and the man who had walked through hell to find her. Not yet, she said. We still have to find the others he hurt. They walked out of the mansion as the first flickers of orange flames began to lick at the curtains in the study. The Vane estate was a pyre for a dead reputation. As they reached the black SUV at the end of the driveway, Hana paused. She looked at the lace apron lying in the mud near the gate. She didn't pick it up. She stepped on it, her heels sinking deep into the white fabric. The drive back to the city was silent, but it wasn't the silence of strangers. It was the silence of two predators who had finished the hunt. Kangde kept his hand over hers, his grip a silent promise. They passed the neon signs of the city, the lights blurring into long streaks of red and gold. Hana watched her reflection in the tinted window. The maid was gone. The dragon's wife had returned. But as they pulled into the underground garage of Kangde's headquarters, the elevator doors opened to reveal a face Hana hadn't seen in years. A man in a police uniform was waiting, his badge glinting in the fluorescent light. He didn't look like he was there to make an arrest. He looked like he was there to report. Sir, the officer said, bowing to Kangde. The shipment Julian Vane was hiding, it's not in the warehouse. He moved it an hour before you arrived. Kangde's grip on Hana's hand tightened. Moved it where? The officer looked at Hana, his eyes flickering with a hesitation that made her stomach drop. To the orphanage, sir. The one where your wife grew up. The air in the garage suddenly felt very thin. Julian Vane hadn't just been a bully, he was a desperate man with a final, ugly card to play. If you think the real monster isn't the one who yells, but the one who hides behind the innocent, drop a like so the algorithm knows this story matters. They were back in the car before the officer could finish his sentence. The orphanage was 3 hours away, nestled in a valley where the fog never truly lifted. Hana's mind raced. The shipment wasn't drugs or money, it was the stolen ledgers that linked Julian to the international human trafficking ring Hana had been investigating. If those papers were found at the orphanage, the sanctuary would be raided, and the children would be scattered to the wind. It was Julian's final act of spite. If he was going down, he was taking Hana's heart with him. The mountain roads were a series of lethal curves. Kangde drove with a cold, mechanical precision, the speedometer needle buried in the red. Hana checked her phone. No signal. The fog began to wrap around the car like a wet shroud. He's trying to beat the police there, Hana whispered. He's going to burn it all to get rid of the evidence. Kangde didn't respond, but the engine roared in protest as he pushed the car even harder. They reached the gates of the orphanage just as the smell of wood smoke hit the air. It wasn't the smell of a cozy fireplace, it was the scent of old, dry timber meeting an accelerant. The main dormitory was already glowing from the inside. A silhouette stood near the entrance holding a gasoline can. It was Julian's brother, Marcus, the man who did the dirty work Julian was too soft for. He saw the headlights and didn't run. He smiled. Hana didn't wait for the car to stop. She was out of the door and running toward the building before Kangde could grab her. She could hear the muffled cries of the children inside, the sound of the fire roaring like a physical weight. Marcus stepped in her way, his hand going to the holster at his hip. The CEO sends his regards, Hana. He said you were always too fond of this place. A shot echoed through the valley. Marcus's gun flew from his hand as a bullet from Kangde's weapon found its mark. Kangde was a blur of movement, tackling Marcus into the dirt as Hana dived into the smoke-filled doorway. The heat was a wall that tried to push her back. She pulled her shirt over her nose, her eyes stinging as she crawled toward the stairs. Min? Sujin. Can you hear me? The roof groaned above her, a flaming beam crashing down and blocking the path to the kitchen. She found the children huddled in the corner of the communal room, their small faces pale with terror. There were 7 of them. The youngest, a 4-year-old girl, was clutching a charred teddy bear. Follow me. Stay low. Hana yelled over the roar. She grabbed the 2 youngest and pushed them toward the window. One by one, she lifted them over the sill and into the waiting arms of Kangde's men, who had appeared out of the fog like wraiths. The air was turning to liquid lead. She went back for the last child, a boy named Leo who had crawled under a heavy oak table. As she grabbed Leo's hand, the floor beneath them gave way. They tumbled into the basement, landing in a pile of old coal and discarded toys. Above them, the stairs were a waterfall of fire. Hana looked around, her lungs screaming for oxygen. In the corner of the basement, she saw it, a heavy metal safe half hidden under a tarp. The shipment. The reason for the fire. She heard footsteps above. Not the heavy boots of Kangdae's men, but the frantic, uneven steps of someone else. Hana. I know you're down there. It was Julian. He hadn't been arrested. He had escaped the transport. His face was blackened with soot, his expensive suit shredded. He stared down through the hole in the floor, a jagged piece of glass in his hand. You took my life. I'm taking yours. He began to pour a container of kerosene through the hole, the liquid splashing onto the coal around Hana. If you believe that a mother's heart can outshine any fire, hit the like button so Hana's light never goes out. Hana pushed Leo behind the safe, her eyes fixed on Julian. The police are minutes away, Julian. It's over. Julian laughed, a jagged, broken sound. I don't care. I'm already dead. He struck a match. The flame danced for a second before he dropped it. The coal pile erupted. Hana didn't scream. She grabbed a heavy fire extinguisher from the wall and blasted the path between her and the window, the white foam cutting through the orange heat. She lifted Leo toward the narrow basement window, pushing him out into the cold night air. But as she tried to pull herself up, Julian jumped down into the basement. He tackled her, his fingers clawing at her throat. You were just a maid, he shrieked. You were nothing. Hana slammed her palm into his nose, the bone crunching. She twisted, using the momentum to throw him toward the growing flames. She didn't look back to see if he got up. She grabbed the ledger from the safe and clawed her way out of the window just as the basement ceiling collapsed. She fell onto the wet grass, gasping for air that didn't taste like ash. Kangdae was there in an instant, pulling her into his arms, his heart racing against her chest. The children, she choked out. Safe. All of them, he whispered. Behind them, the orphanage was a skeleton of fire, a final monument to the Vane family's cruelty. Hana held up the charred ledger. I got it. They're done, Kangdae. All of them. The sun began to rise over the valley, the light gray and cold. The fire had burned itself out, leaving only a smoking ruin. The police arrived, but they didn't come for Hana or Kangdae. They came for the bodies in the basement and the evidence in Hana's hand. Months later, a new building stood in the valley. It was modern, fireproof, and filled with the laughter of children. It didn't have a CEO's name on the gate. It had a single stone plaque, the Dragon Sanctuary. Hana stood in the garden, no lace apron in sight, wearing a simple silk dress that matched the color of the sky. She watched the children play, her hand resting on the shoulder of a man who no longer looked like a monster of the underworld. Julian Vane died in that fire, Kangdae said, stepping up behind her. But the papers you saved put his entire board in prison for life. The syndicate is gone, Hana. For real this time. Hana leaned her head against his shoulder. And Marcus? Kangdae's eyes darkened for a fraction of a second. He'll never see the sun again. I made sure the prosecutor had every single file. Hana looked at her hands. The scars from the fire were fading, but they were there, a permanent reminder of the cost of justice. She looked at Kangdae, the man who had been a mafia boss to the world but a husband to her. I used to think I was a ghost, she said. Ain't nobody cleaning up after people who didn't see me. Kangdae turned her to face him, his hands cupping her face with a tenderness that still surprised her. You were never a ghost, Hana. You were the storm they didn't see coming. As they walked back toward the sanctuary, a small girl ran up to them, clutching a new teddy bear. She reached out and grabbed Hana's hand, her eyes bright with a future that was no longer for sale. Hana smiled, and for the first time in her life, the air didn't smell like rust or decay. It smelled like rain on fresh earth. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories about the invisible ones who take down empires. If this story broke your heart and then healed it, hit the like button so the Dragon Sanctuary grows even larger. The path forward was clear. There were no more secrets, no more laces to tie, and no more tea to serve. There was only the quiet, steady rhythm of a life earned through fire and fury. Hana looked back at the valley one last time, the dragon statue in the center of the garden glinting in the afternoon sun. The maid was gone. The legend was just beginning. The world would remember the fall of Julian Vane, but they would never know the name of the woman who held the match. And that was exactly how Hana wanted it. She was no longer a ghost, she was the architect of her own peace. Kangdae pulled her closer as the sun dipped below the mountains, casting long, peaceful shadows over the land they had saved. The debt was paid. The story was hers. The smoke of the Vane estate was a bitter memory, but in the world of high-stakes shadows, a vacuum never stays empty. While Hana and Kangdae built a sanctuary for the innocent, the remnants of the global syndicate saw the dragon's wife, not as a hero, but as a leak that needed to be plugged. The peace of the valley was shattered not by a bomb, but by a legal summons. 2 weeks after the sanctuary opened, a black car, armored, window-tinted, and bearing a government seal, pulled up to the gates. Out stepped a woman in a razor-sharp charcoal suit, her eyes as cold as the Siberian tundra. This was Inspector Park, the lead of the National Internal Security. "The ledgers you provided were sufficient to bury Julian Vane," she said, tapping a folder against her palm as she stood in the sanctuary's courtyard. "But they also implicate 15 other CEOs, 3 ministers, and the director of the NIS himself. You didn't just burn a mansion, Hana. You ignited a political apocalypse." She leaned in, her voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "And the director doesn't believe in witnesses." Kangdae stepped from the shadows of the porch, his hand resting on the hilt of a concealed blade. "The director can send his regards in person if he's so concerned." Inspector Park didn't flinch. "He won't send regards. He's already sent a cleaning crew. They are currently 3 miles out, and they have clearance for a scorched earth operation. If you stay here, these children die with you." The sanctuary, once a place of healing, became a fortress in minutes. Hana didn't panic. She moved with the cold efficiency of the strategist she had become. She ushered the children into this safety room, a reinforced concrete bunker hidden beneath the dragon statue in the garden. "Stay quiet. No matter what you hear above, you do not open this door until you hear the secret knock," she whispered to Leo, the eldest. As the heavy steel door hissed shut, the first drone appeared over the valley. It wasn't a surveillance drone, it was a tactical quadcopter armed with high-frequency disruptors. The air began to hum, a sound that made the teeth ache and the glass in the sanctuary windows vibrate until they shattered inward. If you believe that a mother's instinct is the most dangerous weapon on Earth, hit the like button so Hana's stand reaches those who think they can target the innocent. The cleaning crew didn't use the front gate. They descended from the cliffs via fast ropes, 8 men in matte black tactical gear, their faces hidden by ballistic masks. They didn't use guns at first, they used specialized gas grenades designed to paralyze. Kangdae met the first wave in the foyer. It wasn't a fight, it was an execution of technique. He moved like a shadow, his movements so fast they blurred, the sound of breaking bones the only rhythm in the hall. But Hana knew this was a distraction. She climbed the stairs to the roof, her feet silent on the tiles. She saw the sniper perched on the ridge, his laser sight dancing across the garden toward the bunker's air vent. She didn't have a rifle. She had a high-intensity signal jammer she had salvaged from Julian's old equipment. She aimed the device at the ridge. The laser sight flickered and died. The sniper adjusted his scope, but the feedback from the jammer sent a high-decibel shriek directly into his comms, causing him to recoil in pain. Before he could recover, Hana was on the move. She slid down the roof's pitch, jumping into the thick foliage of the garden. She didn't run to Kangdae. She ran to the garden's irrigation controls. With a sharp twist of the master valve, she flooded the lawn. Then she grabbed 2 exposed high-voltage cables from the damaged quadcopter that had crashed near the dragon. As the tactical team stepped onto the wet grass, Hana jammed the wires into the water. The garden erupted in a blue-white arc of electricity. The men in tactical gear, weighed down by metal equipment and standing in the conductive pool, were neutralized instantly. They fell like lead weights, their nervous systems overloaded by the search. Kangdae emerged from the building, his shirt torn, blood that wasn't his staining his knuckles. He looked at the smoking garden, then at Hana, who stood by the valve, her hair wild and her eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. "The director's best?" she asked, her voice steady. "The director's only," Kangdae replied, checking the pulse of the fallen leader. But the night wasn't over. A second vehicle approached, not a tactical van but a lone black sedan. It stopped at the gate. The back door opened and a man stepped out. He was old, his hair white, his face a map of institutional power. It was the director of the NIS. He didn't have a weapon. He had a phone. "You've made a mess, Hana. A very expensive, very public mess," he said, walking calmly toward them. "You think you've won because you have a ledger? I have the servers that generate the ledgers. I can make you a terrorist by sunrise. I can make this sanctuary a crime scene." Hana walked toward him, stepping over the neutralized guards. She held up a small silver thumb drive, the one she had pulled from the basement safe before it collapsed. "You're right, Director. You control the servers. But I control the decryption key. And right now, every major news outlet in the world is receiving a dead man switch email. If I don't enter a code in the next 5 minutes, the Director's private offshore transactions become public domain." The Director's calm mask cracked. His eyes darted to his phone. "You're bluffing. You're a maid." "I was a maid," Hana corrected, her voice like a razor. "And as a maid, I learned that you never truly know what's under the rug until you're the one cleaning it. I've been cleaning up after men like you for years. Today I'm just taking out the trash." The silence in the valley was absolute. The Director looked at the woman he had underestimated, then at the man who would kill him without hesitation if she gave the word. He knew he had lost. In the digital age, a secret is only a weapon until it's a broadcast. "What do you want?" the Director hissed. "A full pardon for Kangdae. Legal immunity for the sanctuary. And your resignation effective immediately," Hana said. "Otherwise, the world gets to see why you're so afraid of a little girl's orphanage." 2 minutes later, the Director was back in his sedan, his hands shaking as he made the calls that would dismantle his own career. He left the valley not as a king, but as a man waiting for his own shadow to catch up to him. The sun began to rise, the light hitting the dragon statue and making its golden eyes flare with triumph. The safety room door opened and the children spilled out into the morning air. Leo ran to Hana, hugging her waist. "Did the monsters go away?" Hana looked at Kangdae, then at the peaceful valley. The maid was gone. The dragon's wife was more than a title, it was a shield. "Yes, Leo," she said, stroking his hair. "The monsters are gone. And this time we've made sure they can never come back. If you believe that the truth is the only power that can never be silenced, subscribe to see what happens when Hana and Kangdae take their fight from the valley to the world stage. Drop a like if you think the cleaning crew got exactly what they deserved." The Director's resignation was a tremor, but the earthquake was yet to come. With the political shield gone, the syndicate didn't just want the ledger, they wanted the blood of the woman who had turned their greatest asset into their executioner. Hana sat in the sanctuary's new library, the smell of fresh pine and old paper a temporary balm. She was staring at a photograph she had found tucked inside the secret compartment of the silver thumb drive. It wasn't a bank statement. It was a picture of a woman who looked exactly like her, standing in front of the very orphanage they had just rebuilt, holding a baby with a distinct birthmark on its wrist. The same birthmark Hana saw every time she looked at her own reflection. "Kangdae," she whispered as he entered the room, his footsteps heavy with the weight of the perimeter check. "Julian didn't just pick this orphanage because I was here. He picked it because he was hiding me from someone. Or something." Before Kangdae could respond, the sanctuary's internal sensors shrieked. A single silhouette was moving across the thermal monitors. Not a team, not a drone, but a ghost. The figure moved with a fluidity that bypassed the motion sensors, a phantom cutting through the morning mist. "Stay with the children," Kangdae commanded, his hand going to the suppressed pistol at his hip. "This isn't a cleaning crew. This is a wraith." But Hana didn't stay. She followed the feeling in her gut, the pull of the birthmark on her wrist. She met the figure in the center of the dragon garden. The wraith didn't pull a gun. He pulled a twin-bladed kama, the steel reflecting the moonlight. He stopped 5 feet from her, his head tilting as he scanned her face with a retinal overlay. Subject 7. The wraith's voice was mechanical, distorted by a modulator. "The CEO's debt is irrelevant. The program requires your return. If you believe that your past should never define your future, hit the like button so Hana finds the strength to break her chains." The fight was a blur of lethal geometry. Kangdae intercepted the wraith's first strike, the sparks from their clashing steel illuminating the dark garden. The wraith wasn't human, not entirely. His movements were calculated by an AI processor, predicting Kangdae's every parry. Hana didn't stand by. She realized the wraith wasn't attacking her, he was trying to capture her. She grabbed a heavy garden spade, her fingers finding the balance she had learned during months of hard labor. As the wraith pinned Kangdae against the stone dragon, Hana swung. The edge of the spade caught the wraith's mask, cracking the visor. The mask fell away, revealing a face that made Hana's heart stop. It was the boy from the photograph, the one she thought was her brother. But he wasn't a boy anymore. He was a weapon, his eyes glazed with the blue light of a neural link. "Hana?" he rasped, the human voice struggling against the machine. "Run. They are watching through me." Suddenly, the wraith's body jerked as if hit by an invisible current. The neural link was overriding his autonomy. He lunged at Hana, his blades humming with a high-frequency vibration. Kangde tackled him, the two of them tumbling into the fountain. Hana realized the only way to save him, and themselves, was to kill the signal. She ran back to the irrigation controls, but this time she didn't flood the lawn. She opened the hidden panel to the sanctuary's new power core. She didn't have a jammer, but she had the silver thumb drive. She jammed it into the core's diagnostic port, uploading the Deadman switch code directly into the sanctuary's local grid. The dragon statue began to hum. The gold in its eyes, harvested from Silas's lighter, acted as a natural conductor. A massive electromagnetic pulse rippled out from the monument, a wave of invisible energy that fried every electronic device within a mile. The wraith collapsed, the blue light in his eyes flickering and dying. He lay in the water of the fountain, gasping, the machine finally silenced. Kangde stood over him, his gun raised, but Hana stepped in between them. No. He's the key. He's the only one who can tell us who created the program. If you think the most dangerous enemies are the ones who share your blood, drop a like so the algorithm knows the story just got personal. They moved the wraith, her brother Minsuk, into the bunker. As the sun rose, the blue veins in his neck faded, leaving behind a man who looked haunted by 1,000 lives he didn't choose. He looked at Hana, his hand reaching out to touch the birthmark on her wrist. They didn't just want a maid, Hana. They wanted a sleeper agent. You were the only one who successfully resisted the conditioning. Hana looked at Kangde. The world they had built was safe for now, but the war had just shifted from the boardrooms to the very DNA in their veins. Then we don't just protect the sanctuary anymore, Hana said, her voice a vow. We hunt the creators. The maid was a memory. The dragon's wife was a shield. But the architect of the vengeance was just waking up. The neural link in Minsuk's neck didn't just fade, it turned a bruised, necrotic purple. He lay on the cold floor of the bunker, his body shivering as his nervous system tried to reboot without the machine. Hana knelt beside him, her fingers pressing into his pulse. It was erratic like a bird trapped in a cage. The program doesn't have a headquarters, Minsuk rasped, his eyes fixed on the concrete ceiling. It's a distributed network. Every maid, every driver, every nobody in the city is a node. I was just the one they turned into a blade. Kangde stood by the heavy steel door, his eyes fixed on the security monitors. The EMP had fried the syndicate's tech, but it had also blinded their own cameras. They were in a dark box, surrounded by a forest that was suddenly full of ghosts. We can't stay here, Kangde said, his voice a low vibration. If he's a node, they'll find the signal's point of failure. They'll send a cleanup crew that doesn't rely on electronics. Hana looked at the silver thumb drive, now glowing with a faint, residual heat in the diagnostic port. They won't send a crew, she said, her voice dropping an octave. They'll send a reset. Julian's files mentioned it. If a subject becomes a liability, they incinerate the entire sector. She looked at Minsuk. Where is the master server, Minsuk? Not the digital one. The one that holds the original DNA sequences. Minsuk's hand gripped her wrist, his skin searingly hot. The Jeju underwater lab. Beneath the volcanic shelf. If you don't kill the source, I'll never be free. And neither will you. The journey to Jeju was a descent into a world of forged identities and silent docks. They didn't take a private jet. They took a rusted fishing trawler across the strait, hidden among crates of salted mackerel. Hana spent the nights on the deck, the sea spray stinging the scars on her hands. She wasn't thinking about the fire or the CO anymore. She was thinking about the woman in the photograph. The program hadn't just stolen her life, they had manufactured it. They reached the volcanic cliffs of Jeju under a moonless sky. The laboratory wasn't a building. It was a pressurized dome 300 feet below the breaking waves, accessible only through a sea cave that breathed with the tide. Kangde checked his gear, mechanical blades, a manual action shotgun, and a heart full of cold iron. If I don't come back up, he told Hana, you take the children and disappear into the mountains. Don't look for the truth. Just live. Hana grabbed his collar, pulling him close until their foreheads touched. We don't live in the shadows anymore, Kangde. We burn them. I'm going in with you. I'm the only one who can bypass the biometric locks. I'm Subject 7, remember? My blood is the key. If you believe that the truth is worth more than a safe life, hit the like button so Hana and Kangde's fire reaches the deepest parts of the ocean. The sea cave was a throat of jagged basalt. They dove into the black water, their lungs burning as they followed a guide wire left by a previous defector. They emerged into a decompression chamber that smelled of ozone and salt. The air was cold, recycled, and thin. As the inner doors hissed open, they weren't met by guards. They were met by silence. The laboratory was a cathedral of glass and steel, filled with thousands of floating cylinders. Inside each one was a person, a ghost in waiting. Some were children, some were old men, but all of them had the same vacant, peaceful expression. Hana walked past the rows, her reflection ghostly against the glass. She saw faces she recognized from news reports, from the Vane estate, from the streets of Seoul. They aren't just nodes, she whispered, her voice echoing in the vast space. They're backups. Suddenly the lights flickered to a blinding, clinical white. A voice boomed over the intercom, a voice that was perfectly modulated, devoid of age or gender. Subject 7. You've returned to the archive. How very efficient of you. We were worried the EMP had damaged your cognitive functions. A wall of monitors descended, showing a live feed of the sanctuary. The children were sitting at the breakfast table, oblivious to the red laser dots dancing across the dragon statue in the garden. Step into the extraction chair, the voice commanded. And the dragon's sanctuary remains a sanctuary. Refuse and it becomes a crematorium. Hana looked at Kangdae. He was already moving toward the guard station, but he stopped as a row of ceiling-mounted turrets locked onto him. Don't, Hana said, her voice steady. She walked toward the extraction chair, her fingers tracing the leather straps. She looked up at the camera lens in the center of the room. You want my blood? Come and take it. As she sat in the chair, the mechanical arms moved to secure her wrists. But she wasn't looking at the needles. She was looking at the silver thumb drive she had pawned from Minsuk. She didn't jam it into a computer this time. She jammed it into the manual override port of the extraction chair's life support system. I'm not a node, Hana hissed as the needles pierced her skin. I'm the virus. The thumb drive didn't just contain a ledger. It contained a recursive loop of the dead man's switch code, amplified by the laboratory's own power grid. The glass cylinders began to vibrate. The water inside them turned a violent, bubbling red. The voice on the intercom shrieked, a sound of digital agony. What have you done? You're destroying the archive. I'm freeing the ghosts, Hana replied. If you believe that some things are too broken to be saved and must be destroyed to be reborn, drop a like so the algorithm knows the program is falling. The explosion didn't come from a bomb. It came from the pressure. The glass cylinders shattered simultaneously, a tidal wave of salt water and chemicals sweeping through the lab. Kangdae grabbed Hana as the chair's restraints failed, pulling her toward the emergency ascent pod. The room was a chaotic swirl of red liquid and screaming alarms. As they breached the surface of the ocean, the sea cave collapsed behind them, the laboratory swallowed by the volcanic shelf. Hana lay on the black sand of the beach, gasping for air, her blood staining her white dress. She looked at her wrist. The birthmark was still there, but the Subject 7 tattoo beneath the skin had been burned away by the electrical surge. The voice was gone. The nodes were silent. Minsuk, waiting in the boat, felt the pressure in his head vanish, replaced by a silence so profound he wept. They returned to the sanctuary as the first snow of winter began to fall. The dragon statue was covered in a white blanket, its gold eyes looking out over a valley that was finally, truly silent. Hana didn't go back to being a maid, and Kangdae didn't go back to being a boss. They sat on the porch, watching the children play in the snow, a family built not on blood, but on the fire they had survived together. Is it finally over? Leo asked, catching a snowflake on his tongue. Hana looked at the horizon, where the city lights of Seoul were a distant, harmless glitter. She felt the weight of the silver drive in her pocket. Empty now, a hollow shell of a war that was won. It's over, Leo, she said, leaning into Kangdae's warmth. The ghosts are gone. We're the only ones left. The maid was a legend. The dragon's wife was a queen. And the architect was finally at peace.